Chapter 49, Summer's End. Summer's End. Fritha stretched slightly, the girl next to her murmuring quietly, and Fritha lay still again, letting herself settle back into the crook of Nalia's arm. A shaft of pale sunlight had found its way through the chink in the curtains, opening a pane of light on the wall opposite, and Fritha watched it brighten and fade with the passage of the clouds outside as she thought back to the previous evening. Last night had been lovely, all of them walking about trade meet, enjoying the celebrations of the townsfolk. Her, Nalia and Ari talking and laughing and teasing each other warmly, just as they had once always done before all the bards and burglary had got in the way of things and had made their simple friendship so complicated. Cool smooth fingers began gently stroking her forearm, the warm body next to her stirring from sleep. Nalia had appeared at her door an hour or so before the dawn in slip and shawl, saying she couldn't sleep, and the pair had returned to Fritha's bed together, Fritha waking a couple of hours later in a tangle of limbs and linen. A sigh next to her, the girl at her side stretching as she had, before propping herself up on an elbow to mumble a greeting.
"Good morning, dearest."
Fritha smiled slightly.
"Morning. You managed to get some sleep then?"
she confirmed, and Nalia nodded, hiding her yawn under the edge of the blankets, her freckled nose crinkling with the gesture. Fritha's smile broadened.
"You look like you could use a few more hours." No, I'm fine,"
Nalia dismissed with a smile of her own, though she made no move to get up, instead settling back down next to her, and the two lay in comfortable silence for a few moments more, before Fritha finally decided it was time to voice the question that had been haunting her ever since the girl had arrived so early that morning.
"So why couldn't you sleep then? You seemed tired enough when we retired last night."
Next to her, Fritha heard the girl sigh.
"I was, but once I was laid in bed, I could not seem to stop thinking about."
A pause, Nalia's voice, when it came, unusually quiet.
"About what Squire Dextes told us, about my keep."
Fritha shifted slightly, but couldn't move very far. Nalia was laid on her hair. The girl had told her when they had first moved to expose Isia what it could mean for her, the man's control of her home void once his crimes had been proved.
"If Isia is found guilty, then his claim on your lands will be no more,"
Fritha heard herself say, almost as though challenging the girl to deny it. She felt Nalia shrug.
"There is a chance Lord Farthington Renal, his father, will put forward a case to keep it. It will all depend on the magistrate's decision in the end."
Fritha's gaze travelled up to the ceiling, looking without really seeing. So this was it, the beginning of the end. Part of her had always known Nalia would not last the winter with them, the squire's news of Isia's trial last night merely putting a timescale on the thing. It would be only a few months before the outcome was decided one way or another, and Nalia could once more be mistress of her lands. Fritha would have to be mindful that any work did not take them too far from the city in the months to come, in case Nalia was needed before the magistrates.
"Are you all right, dearest? You seem—" "Yes, I'm fine,"
Fritha muttered, finally sitting and briskly throwing back the covers to get out of bed, lying next to the girl no longer the comfort it had been.
"We should get up, we've that meeting with Coprith today." "Yes. I should have a bath, do you need one?"
Fritha shook her head, still searching through her bag and not even looking up as she answered her.
"No, I had one last night when I came in." "Oh. I see."
Fritha glanced up. Nalia still sat amongst the crumpled blankets, looking a touch hurt, though resignedly so. Fritha sighed to herself. This wasn't anyone's fault. She couldn't blame the girl for wanting back the life that had been stolen from her. Nalia belonged at her keep, ruling her people justly as she had been brought up to do. Why, by the time the trial was over and the decision made, Mon could be back with them, perhaps they could all find a home there.
Well,
sighed Nalia, making to throw the blankets off as well.
I should return to my own room and make myself presentable, then.
Frithia swallowed dryly. Would she let the time they had left be ruined by the fact they may have to part?
Will you wait a moment and dress my hair before you go?
Nalia smiled. A gnomon stepped from the fourth-floor landing and began the long descent downstairs. Yesterday's abrupt confirmation that the Order's judgment was mere days away had given rise to another bout of poisonous ill-humor, and he had been more than glad they had ventured from the inn to join the celebrations of the townsfolk. The general air of revelry had calmed his nerves, distracting him from his fate, and by the time they had returned to the inn, the hour was late enough that he had no chance for worry then either, falling deeply into a dreamless sleep as soon as he had retired. And then there was the presentation ceremony over at the town hall that morning, a gnomon considered with some pride. Though he was sure it was probably too late for anything he did to influence the outcome of the Order's judgment, he felt that news he had been part of the group who were now being hailed as heroes of trade meat certainly couldn't hurt. And it was on that thought he finally stepped down into the tavern. Early though it was, he was not the first to have come down to breakfast it seemed. Frithia and Minsk were already sat at a table in the far corner, though he could barely see the pair for the press of people surrounding them, Minsk impressing a group of local youths with a story, while at Frithia's side stood a young man of the usual Amnian coloring, his features sculpted and handsome enough that a gnomon could notice it.
"Milady,"
the man greeted with a slight bow.
"I am Oziel, a local bard, and it would be the greatest honor if I were to be able to put an account of your glorious quest to save trade meat to song." "Oh, well, that's, very kind of you."
A gnomon smiled slightly. It had been the same last night, everyone they met full of thanks and praise, though it was something that was apparently easier to bear in numbers. Frithia an uncomfortable shade of pink as she smiled and nodded, though Minsk, at least, looked to be enjoying himself. The bard seemed undeterred by her discomfort though, Oziel still pressing his case.
"Indeed, all I would need is an hour or so of your time to get the details of the trials you faced. Perhaps we could discuss it this evening over dinner."
A gnomon frowned as Frithia flushed even pinker.
A gnomon,"
she called, spotting his approach through the press and looking relieved for the interruption. Oziel stepped back slightly, allowing a grey-haired woman of late middle age, who looked to be wearing every piece of jewelry she owned, to take his place.
"My lady, let me offer my thanks for you and your group's worthy deeds. My family is as much indebted to you as any other in trade meat, and though I can offer you no coin or song, I would like to show our appreciation nonetheless." The women reached out with a rattle of gold bangles to cover the girl's hand with her own more bejeweled fingers. "I am Serena, my lady, one gifted with the true sight, and would be more than happy to use my powers to your benefit should you wish to visit my home for a reading. Ask Viatri for the directions, he knows of me." "Oh, thank you, madam, you are most kind to offer."
The woman nodded deeply and stepped back just as the maid appeared, a tray of cups and a teapot balanced on one hand and a trencher of bread and cheese set against the opposite hip, and everyone had the good manners to make their farewells and quickly depart, allowing them to begin their breakfast in peace.
A soothsayer, who sees trouble ahead. "Oh, Minsk. Good morning, a gnomon, did you sleep well?"
Frithia greeted as he finally arrived at the table. He had not noticed it before, but she seemed to have dressed for the presentation at the town hall, Nalia's green sash about her waist and her hair loose, pulled back from her temples with her wooden hairpins as it had been on the night she and Nalia had gone out dancing. And now a Noman glanced to Minsk. He thought the ranger's fine green tunic was one he had not seen before either.
Very well, thank you, my lady,
a Noman answered, still wondering whether he should change into something more formal as well as he took a seat.
I notice we are as no less popular this morning. Did I hear correctly that one of the local women has offered to tell your fortune in her gratitude? You should attend, my lady. She can tell us if we are to have any trouble on our return to the city, forewarned is forearmed, as they say.
He had meant it as a joke, such women know for peddling their skills at local festivals and fairs, and he laughed, expecting the other two to join him. But Minsk merely frowned, Frithia glancing between them with a wary look.
Who does not think you should go, young Frithia? Who does not think you should go where?
Questioned Jahara, suspicion clear in her narrowed eyes as she arrived to take a seat.
To visit a fortune teller,
answered Frithia.
One of the local women has just offered me a reading. Do you recall that seer at the midsummer celebrations back in the gate?
Jahara frowned.
Yes, I do, and her ensuing hysterics. Do you really think you should accept this offer? I'll think about it. I don't want to hurt her feelings.
Frithia sighed, nodding to the maid as she reappeared to set a basket of fruit before them.
Thank you.
Jahara and Minsk shared a dark look, providing a Noman a moment of silence in which to give a voice to his mounting confusion.
Am I to take it that you believe in such parlor tricks, my lady?
Frithia shrugged mildly as she served herself some tea.
Yes. Well, I believe the ones I've met so far anyway, in that I haven't had much luck with them.
A Noman blinked, still none the wiser, as Frithia no doubt realized, for, after a moment's pause, she took his hand, bringing it closer to her face, eyes narrowed and voice tinged with an accent he couldn't quite place.
Ah, yes, my child, yes, you are new to this life, I can tell.
She breathed dreamily, stroking gently along his palm and causing him to color uncomfortably, though she did not seem to notice.
Along your lifeline I see a scholarly influence, you were well educated, child. But let us go further back, further. I see. Ah!
She cried out so suddenly she made him jump, Frithia dropping his hand as though it burnt, her fear apparent.
Frithia! Nothing!
She cried, eyes wide as she shook her head.
I see nothing. You will live a long and happy life, child. Back from me!
She shrieked as he tried to lay a hand upon her arm.
Keep your gold, I'll not touch it.
And just as suddenly the wildness was gone and Frithia was leaning back in her chair smiling gently, Jahara shaking her head with a wry amusement while Minsk was sending the girl a reproachful look. Frithia sighed.
And that is why I believe them.
A Noman nodded once, still trying to find his voice. All an act, of course, but one that had scared him all the same. She seemed to read his thoughts on his face, for when she spoke again her voice was apologetic, though it still contained a hint of smile.
I'm sorry, a Noman, did I frighten you? A little,
he conceded graciously and her smile broadened.
I'm sorry. I must admit, it worried me too when I first heard it, but... You were worried when you first heard what?
Came Ari's voice behind him, a Noman turning to see the elf arrive at the table as well, Herr Dallas and Nalia in tow. Frithia grinned.
When I first heard Lord Coprith is expecting a speech at the presentation ceremony, but I felt a lot better after I volunteered you for it, Ari. Oh, very funny,
said Ari sarcastically, though she smiled and laughed with everyone else, Cern joining them but moments later, and the mood was light as they took breakfast together. But for all that, a Noman still felt a touch uncomfortable. He might not have understood the fuss before, but now he agreed with Jahara and Minsk, and most wholeheartedly too. Fritha shouldn't be allowed within 10 feet of any fortune-tellers if that was to be their reaction. When he first learned of her heritage, he had been more focused on what dark influence her blood could have on her, and he had overlooked the other ways it could affect a life. Her heritage was no doubt the reason she was sentenced without trial back in Candlekeep, and why she could not linger in the gate after Saravok's defeat, and even the mage, Irenicus's attentions now perhaps were clearer to him. And yet for all that, Fritha seemed so unspoiled for it, not bitter or angry or even wary, and it was easy to forget sometimes she was one of the children, to the point where it was almost a surprise when he was reminded of it. He glanced across the table to the girl, now giggling with Nalia as she slyly fished a stray curl from her teacup. He wondered if Jahara and Minsk forgot about it too. Fritha stared up into the lifeless grey eyes, the face in which they were set disturbingly familiar.
By Berver, this, I never would have dreamed. Ha! It does make for quite the anecdote, doesn't it, my dove? Minsk has never felt such pride, who weeps in his happiness.
Fritha let their words drift over her, her eyes still travelling the features before her like some eerie stone mirror. All except for the expression, of course, the face wearing a look of solemn nobility. Fritha couldn't ever recall wearing an expression like that.
Well, I think there's been quite a bit of artistic license on mine,
she commented with a wry smile, finally tearing her gaze from the face of the statue to run an eye over the neat waves of its hair.
Still, I suppose frizzy is quite a difficult effect to capture in stone. Fritha,
laughed Nalia, slapping her arm and letting her hand linger after the contact, gently slipping it through her elbow to link arms with her. The presentation ceremony that morning had been a simple enough affair, Lord Coprith merely lauding their services to the town for the benefit of the assembled nobles and guild masters before handing Fritha a heavy purse to a background of polite applause. It was only when Coprith mentioned something about a lasting testament to their achievements that Fritha felt her nerves begin to prickle, the man leading the assembly outside into the public gardens to observe the park's latest addition. Fritha took a step back, letting her eyes run over the statue as a whole. She was surprised how quickly it had been erected and suspected magic may have played a part, but if the craftsmanship had suffered because of it, she had yet to notice. In fact, the resemblances were perfect as far as she could tell, almost eerily so. 8 statues in light grey stone were grouped upon a large square plinth in the center of the park that stood directly behind the town hall, as though to guard against future misfortune. Minsk and Anomen, being the tallest, were at the back, Cerned and Jahara at either end, while before them she, Nalia, Ari and Herdalis were stood. The tiefling, more than pleased his shorter stature, had earned him a place on the front row where, to use his own words, people could best appreciate him. And the rest of the ceremony seemed to go by in a blur after that, Fritha unable to tear her gaze away from the statue above her as Coprith finished his speech and brought the ceremonies to a close, and Fritha had not moved since. She stared up at her stone twin, the girl gazing off into the distance, looking every inch the hero Fritha was reputed to be. If she was honest, she felt a bit uncomfortable about the whole thing, but there was little she could do now, and she suspected she was just being silly anyway. No one else seemed to feel similarly, she considered, as she watched the others gazing up at the statue with a mix of satisfaction and awe.
Well,
Fritha sighed, more than happy to move on.
I think I am going to make another attempt at selling our accumulated loot now the marketplace seems a bit more lively. Anyone else coming?
Jahara and Cerned predictably declined the offer. Cerned was still uncomfortable when out in the town, though there had been no trouble the previous evening, and Fritha wondered if it wasn't just how he felt in any settlement larger than a village. Jahara was happy to accompany him though, the two planning to walk out into the surrounding forests, and the rest of them joined Fritha, the group wandering about the market, spending their share of the reward money, while she tried to get decent prices for the assorted jewelry and weapons they had amassed since leaving the city.
Right, what else?
Fritha muttered to herself as she took the 2 neatly folded tunics from the merchant with a nod of thanks and pushed them with some difficulty into her already stuffed bag. She normally wouldn't have bothered with such indulgences, even when, after months of traveling, at least one of her old tunics was more darning that cloth. But quite a few of the merchants seemed to be nursing hangovers that morning, no doubt caused by the previous night's excesses, and though Fritha wasn't sure whether this was the cause or whether it had something to do with who they were, but she was certainly finding haggling a lot easier than usual. She had already sold Khan's sword for a very good price to a merchant dealing in rare arms, though her own purchases came from much more mundane stalls, the girl making sure to stock up on food and other essentials ready for the trip back to Athkatla on the morrow. For a moment, she let her eyes travel those gathered about her, Ari showing Nalia a necklace she had just bought while Minsk had invested in a new belt, the man adjusting and readjusting it, the new leather stiff and unyielding.
I should really get a new sword as well, before we leave for the city,
Fritha continued to no one in particular, frowning down at the battered old blade that hung at her hip, a souvenir from the Rakshasa's house.
This one is far too long for me. I noticed a place we passed just back around the corner, my raven,
offered Herr Dallas.
It looked to have a fair enough selection.
They followed his advice and his lead, and soon the group were stood before a large square awning, 3 of the 4 sides hung first with canvas and then simple wooden frames, row upon row of swords hanging from pegs set into the wood and grouped according to price. Fritha stepped under the shelter of the canopy, ignoring the more ornate swords that rested on racks behind the thick-set merchant's counter and letting her eyes drift over the rows of more reasonably priced weapons, Minsk taking down ones here and there for closer inspection.
This one, young Fritha,
he began, and she turned to look at the sword he was proffering her when she stopped, her breath catching in her throat as her eyes fell upon a familiar blue enamel scabbard. With a hand that no longer felt like it was her own, she reached past Minsk and took the sword down, drawing it a foot or so from the scabbard, and she felt as though she recognized every nick and scratch along the fine steel blade.
It's my sword,
Fritha breathed, turning it over and over in her hands, running her gaze back and forth along its length as though still looking for some sign she was mistaken. Nalia sent her a puzzled frown.
I thought you left your broken sword in the swamp.
Fritha shook her head.
No, not that one. It's the one I left Candlekeep with, the one Flydia gave to me. It was gone from my belongings when we escaped from Irenicus's dungeon. I thought it lost forever. And what, my raven, happened to your claims of?
The tiefling raised his voice in high falsetto.
A sword is just a sword, it is not anything to get attached to. Herr Dallas,
scolded Ari, and Fritha sent him a rueful grin.
Oh, see me eat my words.
Herr Dallas smiled, taking it from her to examine it as she had.
Well, if you were going to get attached to anything, it would be this. It is quite beautiful. Let us see how much it is.
He glanced up to the racks to find the price.
300 gold pieces, hardly a king's ransom. Are you going to buy it? Can I help you?
Came a voice, smooth and obsequious, and Fritha turned with the others to see the merchant stood behind her. He was a stout man of Amnian coloring, though he certainly moved quietly for someone of his build, and Fritha had the sudden feeling he had been listening to their exchange all along.
Yes, my hound, we were looking to purchase this sword.
The merchant smiled, taking the blade from the tiefling to glance it over, his face suddenly pulled into a pained frown, thick lips pressed together beneath his bushy black mustache.
Oh, no, what was this doing here? Why this sword should be over there?
He continued, gesturing behind him to a rack much closer to his counter.
Why, for a blade of this quality, I could accept no less than 500. I beg your pardon,
came Nalia sharply, pointing to the sign next to them.
It says almost half that there.
The merchant smiled sympathetically.
An oversight, my lady, my son must have misunderstood me and placed it in amongst these lesser blades. You,
growled Minsk, both Ari and Anoman moving quickly to take an arm each as Fritha raised her hand to stall the ranger, the merchant looking rather alarmed, though it passed in the blink of an eye, the smooth ingratiating air about him once more.
Now, sir, I am not an unreasonable man. I know of your services to our town, my lady, and since it is of such importance to you.
He made a show of giving the blade an appraising look.
450, not a coin less.
Fritha recognized the opening to haggle when she heard it, but even bartering she knew he would not lower the price below the 300 she had originally been hoping to negotiate on, and the girl shook her head, beckoning to the others.
Come on, it's not worth that, even to me.
But, my lady, began Anoman, but she cut him off with a sweep of her hand.
It's his to price as he wishes. Let some other poor fool get cheated.
The merchant went to speak at this, whether to complain or to better his offer it did not matter. Fritha had already turned to continue on, the others following her, though some more reluctantly than others, and the rest of the day passed pleasantly enough. Fritha ended up with quite a haul in the end, buying a new blue woolen coat to wear under her cloak and some wolf pelts she intended to use as bedding now the weather was getting colder. She couldn't seem to find another sword though, and eventually she gave up the search. She knew in her heart that buying one would have meant she had truly given up on her old one, and she wasn't ready to do that just yet, resolving to return to the market in the morning before they left. Their shopping done, they left the busy streets at Ari's suggestion, stepping from the shelter of the walls to walk the outskirts of the town, finally coming upon the plain where the caravans had made their camp. It was all but deserted now, the remaining few merchants informing them that Fald and the two boys had left for Umar that morning, the man apparently still singing their praises from the day before. It was late afternoon when the group set off back to the town, meeting Jahara and Cerned quite by chance just inside the city walls. The pair had returned from their walk in good spirits, and together they all took one last look about the fading marketplace, the crowds much reduced at that time of day, and Fritha suspected that even Jahara found pleasure in the diversion. And it was as the temple bells tolled 6, that they finally took a table outside the Foxhole, a tavern situated just on the edge of the town park, though the trees were numerous enough that a certain new addition to the scenery was not visible, something which Fritha was very glad of. They took a meal and ended up spending the entire evening there, just drinking and talking, Fritha eventually putting on her new jacket against the chill as the sunset and the twilight drew in. Fritha sighed, watching the soft glow of the lanterns strung above them. It was lovely sat there, the noise of the tavern at their back, the silent park before them, and her in the half-light in between surrounded by friends. Herr Dallas and Jahara were squabbling amicably, while Ari and strangely enough, Minsk, teased Nalia about the attention she was apparently getting from the young waiter who was keeping their table and drinks. It was perfect, perhaps too much so, and Fritha knew it was not made to last. The sun was up and the market was already starting to get busy as they left the main square. Breakfast had been a quiet affair that morning, Anoman joining Fritha and Nalia at the table, the girls explaining that everyone else was still busy trying to find room in their packs for their new purchases. And it seemed Fritha had had every intention of taking advantage of this distraction, the girl casually mentioning that she might go and visit the seer, Serena, since she had the time. Once this was revealed, of course, he would hear nothing against his accompanying her, and so the three had set off soon after, though Nalia walked with them only part of the way before she realized she had forgotten to buy more arrows yesterday and hurried back to the market, and that had left just the two of them. ARandomAudiobookAppeared drew a deep breath of sharp morning air. It was pleasant there, walking through the wide streets of trade meet with Fritha in companionable silence, the girl looking nice in her new blue coat and old violet scarf. He had never much liked Athkatla, with all its crowds and corruption, and this trading town reminded him of the one near to the seminary he had grown up in, all tall stone houses with brightly painted gables. His family had a summer house similar up in the hills as part of their vineyards, and when he was a boy, they would spend Flame Rule and sometimes Eliasias there, when the humid Athkatlan heat was at its worst. He smiled to himself as he recalled the many happy summers he had spent there with Moira and his mother, and he was suddenly struck with a pang of sadness as he realized that his family may not even own the place anymore. His father could have sold it to clear part of his debts, after all. Here, came Fritha at his side, and he broke from his reverie to see her pointing down a wide avenue that branched off to their right.
Her house should be just at the end of this street.
They took the turning, falling into step once more, a comfortable silence over them, and they were almost halfway along the street before it was broken again.
My lady, are you sure you wish to do this? If she is a charlatan, she will merely make something up, and if she is not...
He trailed off, unable to put the sudden anxiety he felt into words. Fritha just smiled though.
Don't worry, ARandomAudiobookAppeared, it will be fine. I'll tell her not to bother looking into my past. What's the point when I've already lived it anyway?
She laughed. ARandomAudiobookAppeared sighed, wishing she would just try to take his concerns seriously for once.
But, why would you want to risk her sensing something in you?
He pressed.
And if she truly has the skills she claims, do you not think she would be in the employ of kings?
Fritha laughed brightly.
Make up your mind, ARandomAudiobookAppeared, you either believe she has the power or not. You cannot be worried about both. Ah, here we are.
ARandomAudiobookAppeared glanced back to their path as they rounded the curve in the street to see the tall neat house slowly swing into view. The woman he recognized as Serena sat at a table outside sunning herself in the weak autumn sunshine as she drank from a stone tankard. She seemed oblivious to their approach though, and as they drew closer he noticed she was not merely sat, but doing something with a talus deck, a few of the cards fanned out on the table before her, the rest of the deck still in her hand, while at her elbow rested a small wooden box and a bag of faded purple silk. Next to him, Fritha coughed politely and the woman opened her eyes, blinking a moment in the sunlight before she seemed to recognize them.
Ah, my lady, you have come,
she cried with a smile, tidying away the cards and rising to greet them properly.
Ah, and you have a gentleman with you, does he wish for a reading as well?
ARandomAudiobookAppeared dipped a stiff bow.
No, thank you, madam, I merely came for the walk. Indeed? Well, I hope it did you good, sir. Now, let us get started, shall we, my lady?
Serena smiled, returning her attention to Fritha and gesturing for the girl to take the chair opposite as she herself sank back into her seat to begin rummaging in the box, removing various bits of crystal and bone to place into the faded silk bag.
Now I will need something from you, my lady, an item of great personal value.
ARandomAudiobookAppeared watched as Fritha's fingers moved to the cord at her neck without hesitation.
Will this be okay?
Serena smiled, taking the smooth jade pendant in her hands, allowing her fingers to caress it a moment before she placed it in the bag with the others.
Yes, yes, that will do nicely. And when is the day of your birth, my lady?
She continued, still adding things to the bag.
I don't know.
The woman glanced up at this, but eventually shrugged.
I see. Well, no matter, no matter. Are you ready then, my lady?
Fritha nodded brightly and Serena smiled, closing her eyes to lay one gnarled hand over her smooth pale one, the bag held tightly in her other. Their heads leaned in close as they began to talk quietly, and a no-man moved away, taking a seat on a wall across the street to wait for them to finish. After all, a person's future should be their own. Her shopping done, Nalia took a moment to sit on a wall at the edge of the main market square and watch the world go by, the chatter of the fountains a pleasant contrast to the low roar of people that filled the marketplace. They would be leaving for Athkatla within the hour, returning to that city to start anew the depressing search for work which would lead them who knew where, while all the time her keep's fate hung in the balance and she was powerless to do anything more than cling to the hope it would one day be hers again. Nalia sighed, trying not to let her thoughts take this dark path, though it was difficult not to brood so. She was not sure when the young girl had taken a seat next to her, only that she was suddenly aware she was not alone. Nalia looked the girl over from the corner of her eye. The child was no more than 7 summers, dressed for travel in a cloak and scarf, her dark hair neatly braided, while a small knapsack hung across her back. The girl noticed her looking to send her a tentative smile.
"Hello, you're one of the people who saved the town, aren't you?"
"Yes, that is so," Nalia answered, not sure what else to add and launching straight into her question,
"Are you supposed to here alone?" "Oh, yes. I'm waiting for the lady from the orphanage to come and collect me. My parents were killed by the nasty animals and I've been living at Joaquin's temple since. But the priests say it's time for me to go and be with other children." "Oh, I am sorry, Nalia? Nalia d'Arnas?"
came a clear bright voice behind her, and Nalia turned to see a pretty young woman beaming down at her in well-made albeit plain cream robes, her blonde hair tidied away in a bun at the nape of her neck. Nalia blinked, feeling rather caught out.
"Ah, yes. I'm sorry, but have we met? I don't seem to recall you."
The young woman laughed warmly.
"Oh, that's hardly surprising. My name is Sophia, Sophia ARain. I was at St. Hilaria's, though I was in a class a couple of years below yours and we rarely mixed. Hello, Teresa, isn't it?"
she asked the girl kindly, the child nodding.
"I'm from St. Sebastian's. Why don't you go and wait with Sister Brianne over there?"
Sophia pointed behind her, the girl jumping lightly from the wall to trot obediently over to a stout smiling woman in robes of cream trimmed in scarlet, her hair hidden beneath a neat white wimple.
"Sister Brianne, you're a nun?"
asked Nalia, astounded one so young could take such a vow, but Sophia just laughed again.
"Oh, no, I'm just a lay sister. The Ilmaterans run an orphanage just a few miles north of the town and I joined to help with the children. In fact,"
she continued slowly,
"you might say you inspired my current path." "I did." "Oh, yes,"
Sophia continued earnestly, taking a seat next to her,
"you and I may not have spoken much at school, but you were a legend in your own right. Us younger girls all knew about you sneaking out at night and the way you helped the local poor, though I am ashamed to say we were more probably impressed by the idea you were breaking the rules than by your charity." "They spoke about me? I never even realized,"
Nalia muttered, half to herself. She had known her own friends thought her behavior merely eccentric. She had never even considered the possibility that others could have seen something to admire in her actions. Sophia smiled kindly and nodded.
"I did not really think about it at the time, but after I returned home to Krimmer, I began to notice it more and more, the beggars and the barefooted children and the mothers with more mouths than they could possibly afford to feed. I could not believe I had just never even noticed them before. My eyes had been opened, and once I knew there was a problem, I wanted to help too."
She smiled wryly.
"My family all thought I was mad, of course. We are not of the nobility, but my father owns a successful business importing exotic goods and he was most displeased I was ruining the family name by slumming. My parents arranged a marriage for me far north in Waterdeep, so I ran away from home and the local priest at the Ilmater almshouse I had been helping arranged for me to get a position here. Ah, listen to me chattering on.
She laughed brightly,
and to you no less. My work must pale next to what you have accomplished. A hero of trade meet? I should have known you would end up eschewing the blessed life of the nobility to work for the common people.
Nalia smiled weakly, the girl's admiration rather embarrassing, especially when considering how she really felt about her current lot.
It wasn't quite like that, to be honest. Once I left school and returned home, I was just helping people as I had always been when, late this Eliasius, my keep came under attack. My father was killed and when I refused to honor my betrothal I lost my home as well. The group who had helped take back my keep kindly let me travel with them. We still help people, of course, but it's different from before. We tend to fight bandits and monsters rather than injustice and though we save people we are also keeping them as they have always been, poor, oppressed.
Nalia trailed off, almost surprised to find someone there next to her, though the girl merely smiled gently.
You sound as though you've lost your way. Perhaps I have. Well, forgive me if I overstep my bounds, but we are forever in need of people at the orphanage, you could always join with us.
Nalia stared at her.
Join with you? Become a lay sister as you have.
Sophia nodded mildly and Nalia turned away, still astounded. She was hardly able to imagine a life different from the one she had then and yet. For so long now she had been struggling on, trying her best to ignore the bitter weather, almost constantly cold and tired, and for a long time now there had been only one thing keeping her there. Or should she say, one person, and Nalia felt a weight descend upon her as she imagined being parted from the girl who had for so long been her friend. And yet Sophia had been right, she had lost her path. She had never wanted to be a hero, saving towns and fighting evil. All she had ever wanted was to help people as individuals, working within the bounds of society to change the rules for the better, making a more just land for all, and for the first time in an age Nalia could see her way clearly. As a lay sister at an Ilmater orphanage, she could make a sound case for herself, showing to the magistrates when the time came, that she had settled down, her months traveling as a mercenary merely overlooked as a wildness of her youth. She could prove to them that she had the maturity and the wisdom to rule her lands in justice and peace just as her father had before her.
I would need to speak with my group.
Nalia heard the words and it took her a moment to realize it was she who had spoken them. Sophia smiled, her blue eyes warm.
Of course, though I should warn you, if you wish to come with us now you will have to hurry. The journey is not an arduous one, but we have children traveling with us and the priest wants us to make the whole way in daylight. We depart trade meet within the hour. So soon?
Nalia cried. Everything was moving so quickly. Perhaps she should wait a while, return to Athkatla with others and make her decision then. To what end? Whispered the voice behind her eyes, sad and resigned, and Nalia felt herself swallow past the sudden lump to her throat. This moment had been coming for some time now, at first no more than a dream. The possibility that her keep could one day be returned had slowly coalesced before her until it was now there, so close she felt all she had to do was reach out and take it. And yet she could not with the life she led now, so far from the expectations society had for one such as her. Nalia drew a breath. She knew what had to be done. She had known this decision would have to be made ever since their meeting with the Squire Dextes. So what was it to be, Fritha or her keep? She could not have both. Nalia closed her eyes, quelled the screaming of her heart and chose.
I will come.
Frithla turned back for one last friendly wave at Serena, the old woman merrily sending her a wave in return. Before Frithla returned her attention to their path, a gnomon at her side as they made their way back to the inn.
So, how was it, my lady?
Began a gnomon as soon as they were out of earshot, and Frithla smiled. She knew he had been concerned, sat on the wall for a good hour as he waited for her, and though she was rather disappointed with the outcome of her reading, she was pleased nothing had happened to worry him further.
Well, I told her not to look too far ahead, some things are best left as surprises, so she just looked a short way and it was just the usual fortune-teller nonsense from then on, all hazy figures and vague predictions, though no hysterics, as you saw, so Minsk and Jahara at least will be pleased. No.
She sighed, feeling her regret anew.
It was all a bit disappointing really. What was it she told me now? She sees a great deal of coin in my future, no surprise there. And I'm to face trials and suffering, also a bit of a given with our line of work. What else, oh, and I will be betrayed by one who I defended to others and will lose a friend, oh, and I'm going to meet the obligatory tall dark stranger, only it will be a woman in this case.
Frithla laughed, cheered by her own wry humor, a gnomon nodding once and clearly trying to hide his relief.
Indeed, well perhaps that is all for the best,
he smiled, and they carried on their way in a heavy silence a moment before a gnomon asked his question.
My lady, I could not help but overhear.
Frithla raised an eyebrow at this, and a gnomon had the decency to look embarrassed before continuing.
That you do not know the date of your birth. That's right. But you said that Imoen gave you your pendant on your birthday,
he pressed, gesturing slightly to her neck and the jade stone they both knew was hidden beneath her scarf.
She did indeed,
Frithla replied, looking unconcerned and feeling rather amused by a gnomon's growing confusion.
But, well, that is. A gnomon, just because I don't know the exact date of my birth, doesn't mean I didn't have a birthday. Didn't?
He questioned, noticing the tense. Frithla shrugged.
Well, it's rather difficult to gauge now I'm no longer in Candlekeep.
Unsurprisingly, a gnomon persisted to look confused, and Frithla toyed with the idea of leaving it at that, suddenly unwilling to share the truth of the thing and dredge of old memories. But it seemed unkind, and finally she relented with a sigh.
I was about 7 years old when Imoen came to Candlekeep, and we were friends almost from that very day, so it was not long before she too found I had no birthday. I remember, it was late summer and we were stood by the main gates, hiding from the guards who would have sent us back to the keep proper had they known we were out. We were talking about our ages. Imoen just couldn't believe I was older than her.
And when she found out I had no birthday, the poor girl had looked distraught.
What, no presents?
She had cried. But then Imoen had seemed to steel herself, as though this doom was something she could save me from, and she had looked at me a long while, taking in every feature before her face had suddenly brightened, and she was dragging me to the gateway and pointing out to the verdant woods beyond it.
See that tree out there?
Imoen had said, pointing to the huge beech tree that grew just outside the gate, so tall we could not see the top from where we stood.
Well, the day the first leaf turns, that shall be your birthday.
Frithla laughed brightly, the memory of it all warming her.
I swear, we used to have such fun in early autumn, sneaking down to the gate every day to see if it was my birthday yet. One year the weather was so mild I had to wait till after.
She glanced up to find a gnomon watching her with an unreadable look.
But now you have left Candlekeep, you do not have one at all.
Frithla shrugged mildly. He didn't understand. Her birthday wasn't about gifts or celebrations for her. It was a game she had played with Imoen back in Candlekeep, an intangible link to her friend and home, and she would rather never have a birthday again than just pick a new date and move on, resigning it to the past, never to happen again. She was aware of the growing silence between them though and sent him a smile.
I still have a birthday, Anomen, I just don't know when it is. Come on.
She continued, quickening her pace, suddenly wanting to be around more people.
The others will be wondering where we are.
Nalia let the wax cool a moment before she stamped it with her seal, hurriedly throwing her wax stick and the leftover parchment back into their case before putting that too in the open bag at her feet, the letter she had just sealed left on the dresser, for the moment forgotten. Everyone had been downstairs taking breakfast when she had arrived, Nalia explaining that Fritha and Anomen had gone to visit the seer before she had given them her own more grim news. The silence that had greeted it had been almost unbearable, the group sending each other dark uncomfortable looks as though no one quite knew what to say, before, at last, Jahara had risen to speak for all of them, saying that she understood her reasons and that she would be missed, the woman embracing her with an affection Nalia had rarely seen from her before. Nalia had left the table soon afterwards, rushing upstairs to pack and all the time worrying what she would do if Fritha did not return before the Ilmaterans arrived to collect her. Nalia sighed, straightening to quickly scan about her for anything else she would need, but the room was clear of her belongings, save for her cloak which still lay on her bed next to her old bow. The group's bow, she corrected herself, and for a moment she lost herself in memories of that day, stood at the hidden sally port before the keep, the trust Fritha had placed in her as she had handed her the bow and had allowed her to join them in the attempt to rescue her father. They had failed in that, but at least the keep had been won back. And it had been the same ever since, the girl giving her a home when her old one was lost to her, even risking her own safety to help her expose Isia. However bad things seemed, Fritha was always there with a ready smile, and Nalia was suddenly struck with a deep sense of sadness as she considered that it could be some time before she would see it again. She stood for a moment, not shying from the feeling, but letting the weight of it impress itself upon her heart, before she realized she was supposed to be rushing and threw on her cloak, the girl finally taking the letter up from the dresser behind her. It was time.
Ah, here we all are.
Fritha greeted brightly, the group all glancing up as she arrived at their table with Anomen.
Finally managed to get everything packed, or will I need to buy a mule?
She laughed.
Fritha,
began Jahara, her face grave, and Fritha frowned.
What's wrong? Were you worried I had gone to visit the seer? Please don't be. She just spouted some rubbish about hardships and dark strangers. She even said I was going to lose a friend of all things. I told her I was way ahead of her there.
Fritha laughed again, her smile fading as no one joined her, and she was about to ask again what was wrong when Nalia arrived at the table, a cloak about her shoulders and pack on her back, and Fritha felt the words die in her throat as she saw the guilt in her friend's eyes.
Fritha, could I talk to you outside a moment?
Fritha just nodded, mutely following the girl out, and they walked a few paces from the tavern door before Nalia stopped, turning back to her, the bright autumn day a cruel mockery of the cold void Fritha could feel swelling just under her ribs.
Fritha, I met someone when I went to the market, a girl who I knew from school. She is a lay sister at an Ilmateran orphanage just north of here, and she says there is a place for me there if I want it.
Fritha said nothing. The cold had suddenly engulfed her heart, and it was all she could do to keep breathing as Nalia took her hand, suddenly desperate.
I'm so sorry, I just can't live this life anymore, always cold, always tired. But it's not just the traveling. With Isia going to trial, there's a good chance I can get my keep back, but it will be impossible if I'm still viewed as Lord D'Arnest's wayward daughter. I will need to show the magistrates I can be trusted with the responsibility of leadership, and I need to be somewhere stable where I can send and receive correspondences concerning the trial.
Nalia was staring down at her, eyes wide as though she was not sure what she would say, but Fritha knew how she had suffered these last 10 days. What other answer could she give?
I understand, Nalia.
Nalia shook her head, her desperation replaced by a melancholy relief.
Oh, my dearest, these last few months have been like a dream.
Fritha smiled gently.
You don't mean a nightmare, do you?
Nalia gave a shaky laugh.
No, no. I've made friends, helped people, done things I never could have imagined myself doing. It is the first time I've felt truly free since I was a child. But it cannot last, not at the expense of others. My lands need me, and once my title is reinstated, I can work towards making a more equitable place for all. Oh, Fritha.
And however much Nalia said the words and knew them to be true, it was still such a wrench leaving her. And Fritha was just stood there, all kind and warm and accepting, just as she had always knew she would be. Nalia dipped her head as the tears began to fall.
Oh, come now, dearest, don't cry, it is for the best, you know it is,
Fritha soothed, taking her scarf off to wind it gently about Nalia's neck and wipe an end across her cheek.
Oh, no, you'll be cold, Fritha.
But she smiled gently and shook her head.
No, I won't. Here, take this. For the orphanage.
Nalia received the small purse with a swallow and a nod.
Thank you, and I know I should be ashamed to ask something of you after all this, but could you grant me a favor, please?
She continued shakily, removing a thick square of folded parchment from her robes.
I've written to my aunt informing her of my plans and asking for her cooperation and support, though I don't know if she'll grant it. Could you deliver it to her on your way back to the city?
Fritha smiled.
Of course, dearest.
Nalia handed her the letter, still sniffing, the tears falling more quickly now as they both sensed their parting was nigh, Nalia pulling her into a fierce embrace, the pair whispering fervently to each other.
Write to me when you can, please. I will, dearest, I promise. And you must come and visit, you and Imoen both. We will come together, as soon as we can. And when I've my lands back, you will come and stay with me. Nothing would make me happier.
They had parted now, Fritha staring up at her dry-eyed, Nalia's face shining wetly as she looked down at her, drinking in every feature of her face as though she thought she could take enough for the coming months apart.
Nalia!
Called a voice, and Fritha glanced over her shoulder to see a young blonde woman dressed for travel, a knot of similarly clothed men and women behind her, a dark-haired girl peering shyly around her skirts.
They need you,
said Fritha quietly. Nalia seemed to be about to say something more but shook her head, words failing her, and Fritha did not blame her. What could be said? The girl just handed her their bow, embraced her one final time and turned to hurry over to them. Fritha watched her until they rounded the corner and were lost from sight, Nalia never once looking back. They had left the table in silence. No one had spoken since the two girls had departed, everyone just sat, insular and avoiding each other's gaze, and yet Jahara could sense the shared tension that linked them all as they waited for the inevitable fallout. Anoman was still stood by the table where Fritha had left him, though he eventually seemed to realize and sat down as well, another few moments crawling slowly by before the door banged open and he was on his feet again, Jahara standing too as Fritha entered. She looked distrait, almost dazed as she crossed to their table, standing before them a moment, just letting her eyes travel over them all until she finally spoke.
"She is gone,"
she said simply, and Jahara felt something inside her twist at the bleakness in her voice.
"My lady,"
began Anomen.
"Ah, not right now, Anomen."
Fritha cut in quietly, shaking her head.
"I think I just need to."
She trailed off, letting the sentence hang unfinished over the table as she turned and disappeared upstairs. Jahara felt herself slump back into her seat, Anomen mirroring the movement as silence returned to the table, though it was different from before, everyone sharing questioning glances, and Cerned let his bag drop from his shoulder with a sigh. It seemed everyone realized they wouldn't be going anywhere for a while, and Jahara felt suddenly angry. Not with the fact their journey was to be delayed or that Nalia had left, but at the world in general. Just when the girl had found some happiness, the fates had seen fit to snatch it away again. She could feel her anger building within her, hands slowly clenching beneath the table, just waiting to snap.
Should someone go and speak to her?"
came Ari quietly.
"By Sylvanus!"
Jahara snapped, slamming a fist onto the table with a ferocity that made them all jump, and she was halfway to the stairs before anyone had recovered enough to call after her. Not that she paid them any mind, the woman taking the stairs two at a time as she tried to wear out her anger. Talk. Speak with her. It was all she ever seemed to be able to do, and it was useless. She was at the 4th floor before she even realized it, short of breath and still full of temper, though she curbed it, moving swiftly to Fritha's door to knock lightly. There was no answer, and though she knew it was pointless, Jahara tried the handle anyway. It was locked.
"Fritha!"
She heard a click, feeling the knob shudder beneath her hand, and she opened the door to find the girl laid upon the bed staring at the ceiling with no sign of having moved. Jahara said nothing, just closed the door behind her and took the chair before the dresser, a silence holding them until.
"I always knew she would leave, but I hadn't thought it would come so soon."
Jahara swallowed, her throat tight.
"I know. I am sorry. I know it can be hard to lose a friend."
"Friend?" Fritha snorted wetly, rolling onto her side to face her.
"She was my friend, yes, but it was so much more. I mean, I thought, I felt."
The girl pressed her lips together, turning her face away as the tears began to fall.
"It hardly matters now, she has gone."
There was no bitterness to her voice, only resignation, and Fritha even managed a watery smile as she turned back to her.
"I'd really rather not leave today, do you think anyone will mind?" "No."
Jahara answered quietly, hearing her cue to return the conversation to more mundane matters.
"I was speaking to Cerned earlier. He has asked if he can travel with us for a while, he wants to see more of these lands." "Yes, fine, whatever you wish,"
Fritha sighed, lying back down once more, and Jahara waited a moment, letting the silence swell around her before she decided there was no more to be done then, the woman crossing the room to draw the curtains against the day, leaving the girl in the gloom. Downstairs, life had returned to the table, and she paused at the foot of the stairs to watch them. Herr Dallas and Ari, his arm about her as he comforted the elf, Cerned watching them, a hand still gripping his bag strap as though still he held an unconscious hope they would be leaving that day. Anomen was next to him, his face unreadable and Minsk. Jahara watched as the ranger glanced up and caught her eye, a question clearly etched on his broad plain face. Jahara sighed and shook her head. End of chapter.